You're with Julian on the Brown Note on Radio Northern Beaches, and I'm sure you can guess what this show is about. David Keith Lynch, born Jan 20, 1946 in Missoula, Montana, who died on January the 15th, just gone. And he would have been 79 years old yesterday. And no director in the modern era has been more comprehensively linked with the world of music than David Lynch. As a composer... We're on to the next song. As a composer, he and Angelo Badalamenti composed that opening theme tune to Twin Peaks, an album I bought when the series hit in 91 and became a global sensation. It also had the best TV soundtrack of all time, which I've continued to play on this show intermittently. He worked very strongly with composers. He released solo albums. His musical industrial soundscapes for a lot of his earlier movies were pioneering, as were a lot of the composition work that he and Angelo Badalamenti would do from Twin Peaks on. And even the music that was chosen for those films has become iconic. Not to mention there were elements such as the Roadhouse stage, which became a haven for band music in the original Twin Peaks series, but particularly a motif in the third Twin Peaks series, The Return. It became a end of each episode for the majority of episodes, an act like Chromatics or Nine Inch Nails or whoever was emblematic of his ethos would play live on on the stage as an end point to that. And there's a word in the Oxford English Dictionary entitled Lynchian, which is noting his penchant for juxtaposing surreal or sinister elements with mundane everyday environments, and for using compelling visual images to emphasize a dreamlike quality of mystery or menace. And I think if you could wrap it up in a nutshell, it's that opening of a film like Blue Velvet where you see the white picket fence, and the same in Twin Peaks, of this idyllic small town life, and where he peels back to reveal the worms in the earth or the appalling violence or abuse behind this idyllic worldview. And even though David Lynch has never made a blockbuster commercial success, he's as well known as Steven Spielberg. Virtually no one has had any bad word to say about this guy in his entire career. And it's a tragic loss. He didn't direct much in the way of films after Mullholland Drive in around 2001, I think. Just Inland Empire, which was, I think, 2006. But we did get 18 hour-long episodes of Twin Peaks: The Return, which was the first new project I gave 10 out of 10 to on this show as a film. And I did give that film my number one film of the year. I wasn't alone in calling it a film. And I did say at the time, and I'll try and find the reviews I did nearly 10 years ago of Mullholland Drive and Twin Peaks: The Return, and put the full things on in the links to something. But I did say that it redefined what a TV show was, and it redefined what a movie was at the same time. He worked for many years trying to get his first project together in the 1970s called Eraserhead, which is probably one of the most watched art house films of all time. It was one of the strangest things that people had ever seen, this very stark black and white movie, very abstract, surreal elements, and a very industrial soundscape to it, which was from Alan Splett, who was a composer who won an Oscar for The Black Stallion in 1980. And he does say that he worked with David Lynch on Eraserhead, The Elephant Man, and Blue Velvet, but the latter two of those do seem to be actually from... I'm just checking to see if my film is still going. The latter two of those have different composer credits, so I'm not sure exactly what he was involved with, but Eraserhead was a still iconic film about a man in a hopeless industrialized society with this great fear of his partner becoming pregnant and giving birth to what ends up being a monstrous baby. It's a film that has continued to engage audiences. The fact that it was a hit on the late night movie circuit, particularly in places like, drive-ins or in late night, midnight showings, which actually got him put onto a much bigger project after that. It says a lot to the film. It's still one of the most challenging and unique art house films to have crossed over to some sizable audience. It came out in 1977, I think. Yeah, March 1977. And it still has the power to enthrall and shock and confuse. He was a director that often asked open-ended questions and was more concerned with the question than the answers. I think he's on record as saying that he was actually much more concerned with the question and not providing what Hollywood does, which is wrapping everything up for the viewer, saying, okay, this is the story and this is how you think about it. And this is the result. And it ties off everything. His need to be so questioning and open-ended and creative with that very question often made his work seem impenetrable to the outside. But a lot of his work was incredibly moving and powerful, such as something like Mullholland Drive. So this show is going to be a trawl through the enormous amount of music associated with every single David Lynch project, with the odd review along the way. For Eraserhead, I'd still give it a 9 out of 10. It looks unlike anything else. It looks incredible, and I think it has a strong thematic theme about the fear of a young man being in a domestic environment and having a child on the way, and the terrors that can overwhelm you, particularly in such a bleak industrial landscape. And that is the other thing. I'm going to be focusing a lot on the soundtracks as well. So from Eraserhead, which was the Alan Splett soundtrack and very influential to a lot of industrial sort of soundscapes that would project a nightmarish vision for films, we're going to hear some of that Eraserhead soundtrack. With Julian on the Brown Note David Lynch special, walking through every project that David Lynch made, or major project, and the fact that he was so involved with the music on a level that no other modern composer is, apart from maybe John Carpenter, who did in fact compose a lot of iconic horror soundtracks and still composes albums as well. And that was before industrial music was an even coined term, I believe. That was part of the Alan Splett soundtrack to Eraserhead. Now, David Lynch, after that project, would actually go into a much bigger project on the back of the success of it. It's still quite remarkable that he would actually become involved in such a big biopic as The Elephant Man from, I think, 1980, which starred an incredible John Hurt and Anthony Hopkins and Anne Bancroft and John Gielgud. So he's gone up in the world a lot, and the production values are much higher, but he still had the braveness to continue filming in black and white. So that was quite incredible, that he would have enough pull to make this incredibly stylized art house biopic, which has still got an enormous fan base today. It's not a strictly true version of the story of John Merrick. In the film, his mother was attacked by an elephant and gave birth to this incredibly deformed freak who would become a circus freak and was beaten and abused and, was just looking for a happy life. In reality, he was born with these defects through no elephant involved, and also was actually, by the time of his adulthood, was a very wealthy, well-respected man who, in the era of that kind of circus freak show being very big money, he was actually pretty wealthy. So there were some liberties taken there, but I think it's become the defining document of who he is. And even though Alan Splat did continue to work on this musically, it's got a different soundtrack artist to this film. So from that, by John Morris, some of the soundtrack suite to The Elephant Man. And I'm going to be very annoyed if an advert... I should get YouTube Premium, shouldn't I? This is John Morris and the Elephant Man soundtrack. Sounds a bit like Suspiria. And that was Isabella Rossellini doing Bobby Vinson's Blue Velvet. And Blue Velvet is the film that launched the David Lynch that we know, and his primary concerns with engaging with what life is pretty much launched with that film. It's pretty much ground zero for the idea of the utopian ideal. On the surface, having this subterranean world of darkness and nightmare below it, which is at the heart of virtually everything he did post that point. And it also has Angelo Badalamenti making that film score. We're not playing any of the film score. We've got plenty of Angelo Badalamenti. David Lynch collaborations coming up, including the opening from this show, which was the instrumental version of the track that they made with Julie Cruz. And we're playing her later as well, her Into the Night album that came out at the same time as the Twin Peaks revolution happened, was a dream pop classic album. And he was a New York born composer that formed a lifelong bond with David Lynch after Blue Velvet and made the score for that film. The film itself was and remains iconic and provocative and ground zero for what I call the Twin Peaks universe for me. I have a theory, and that is that Kyle MacLachlan, who plays a very naive, slightly arrogant, all-American preppy schoolboy who discovers an ear in a field that's been cut off from a human being, and then with his girlfriend Laura Dern becomes embroiled in this world of a tortured Isabella Rossellini who was in a relationship with David Lynch for some years and spoke very, very warmly about him recently on his death. She is somebody whose husband has been kidnapped by one of the all-time great awful people in movie history, Dennis Hopper, whose character is terrifying, utterly terrifying. Almost a baseline for the scariest villains, certainly up there with the likes of Joe Pesci in Goodfellas, Begbie in Trainspotting, Hannibal Lecter. Dennis Potter's nitrogen huffing villain is an unforgettable thing, but so is the stylization of the film. It's got a lot of very big people in it as well. Dean Stockwell has a great role in it as well. We'll be hearing from the song that he mimes to, and obviously Angelo Badalamenti's music in it was integral, but so was the use of other songs such as Bobby Vinton's Blue Velvet and the track I'll play in a minute as well. This was, I think I've got that track. Yes, I do. Thank God for that. The film itself, I think, the only criticism of it I do agree with. It was from, I think, Barry Norman, who was a UK film reviewer, like Margaret and David. And sometimes his views on experimental or challenging films were not great. But here he did pick on a point, which is the film pushes the notion that Isabella Rossellini, who's got a husband kidnapped and is in this forced relationship with Dennis Hopper's character, that her enjoyment of that is something the film actually sort of leads up to and then almost backs away from, which would have been a very, very provocative, almost like the film Elle that came out a few years ago with Isabel Huppert, where she was a rape victim who behaved very, very differently to how you would expect a rape victim to behave, and it was very challenging. But overall, it was a neo-noir. I don't think it's a film noir. I think it's a neo-noir because the lead character in it, Kyle MacLachlan, is oblivious to pretty much everything that's happening. And my theory is that at the end of the film in Blue Velvet, the Carl McLachlan character has proven himself to be very, very naturally adept at being this Boy Scout detective, and goes into the witness protection program because he's been involved in these incredible criminalities, and ends up as the FBI agent Dale Cooper in Twin Peaks. And that's my theory. He's changed his name. I don't think David Lynch has ever commented on that, but I can completely see the timeline of Blue Velvet and Twin Peaks working in a manner that the lead character of Blue Velvet changes his name, goes into witness protection, has already proven himself to be proto-FBI material, and ends up as the most famous David Lynch character of all in Twin Peaks. As a film, I think it really does stand up. It's stylistically amazing and thematically very dark. And I think it's only grown over time. So I'm going to give Blue Velvet a straight 10 out of 10 for the influence and for it being that ground zero on the whole underbelly of the white picket fence America, which I don't think anyone did as well at that point. And from that, there's a very iconic scene where the Dean Stockwell character mimes with a light behind, I think a light in his hand, to the song In Dreams, which will never ever be regarded as a romantic song ever again. It's nightmare fuel. And with the Carl McLachlan character already sort of being kidnapped by Dennis Hopper and forced to witness these very strange goings on, it was ground zero for that uniquely surreal world of David Lynch that the other films didn't click in the same manner. So I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10. It's hugely influential, particularly on Twin Peaks. And from that, we're going to hear Roy Orbison and In Dreams. That will never, ever, ever be a romantic song again if you've seen the movie Blue Velvet. After that, he made, I think, a minor fumble, though a very acclaimed one with Wild at Heart in 1990, starring Nicolas Cage and Laura Dern. Cage, I wish he had returned to more David Lynch projects, but I don't believe he ever did. But the one that did was Laura Dern. She did appear in other films by him, including the previous film Blue Velvet, which should have won the Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival, and instead Wild at Heart won it. And I kind of feel like that was like the Oscars when they give an Oscar to the next film someone does rather than the one that they should have won it for. I think in modern times the Shape of Water winning an Oscar when it should have been Pan's Labyrinth 10 years before that. For me, Wild at Heart it's like when Quentin Tarantino came out with Reservoir Dogs and those movies at the start of the 90s. And there was a plethora of imitators. After Pulp Fiction, everyone was trying to make that kind of film, and they did. And mostly they were lackluster carbon copies like Guy Ritchie or someone like that. Wild at Heart feels like that. It feels like somebody took David Lynch, who was a lesser person in a creative sense, and made the film Wild at Heart, which I don't think it fully works. It's more like a combination of how wild can we go scenes. I don't know where his head was at when he was making it. It's supposed to be a black comedy. I feel like Lynch does black comedy much better when he's coming from a serious place rather than starting from zany. And I feel that way about the Coen brothers. I've always hated the Raising Arizona world of the Coen brothers when they've gone straight out zany comedy instead of doing it straight and letting the comedy come from it, which is something that Wild at Heart is. It's got very memorable sequences, and it's got an enormous cast of like Willem Dafoe, Crispin Glover, Diane Ladd, Isabella Rossellini again, Harry Dean Stanton. Like, the cast is off the charts, and it did win the Palme d'Or, but I would say that it probably is one of the lesser films to have won the Palme d'Or. And given what would follow, I wonder if his mind was on something else. And music again was very heavily influenced on the film. A lot more tracks by music artists. Angelo Badalamenti did do the score for this film. I'd only give Wild at Heart a 7 out of 10, to be honest. I don't think it's a particularly good watch, or that it stands up necessarily more than the sum of its parts, which are often... It feels like the shock element is a little bit deliberate here and redundant for itself. It did have a very memorable main song, which will probably get interrupted by adverts, but I'm sure everyone knows this one. You're with Julian on the Brown David Lynch special, and the second most famous piece of music from Twin Peaks was probably that Laura Palmer's theme, and the greatest soundtrack to any TV series ever by miles, which, as I said at the start, showed David Lynch had much more involvement with the music in his projects than any comparable director from the modern era. Given that he is the joint composer of a lot of the music on that soundtrack with close partner Angelo Badalamenti and a few vocal tracks from Julie Cruz as well, even the lyrics on some of the tracks. And Twin Peaks was a watershed moment, perhaps the most impact that he has had on culture apart from the Lynchian motif of the dark underbelly of a suburban utopia, was a technical one. And that was the fact, I think when I was talking about it ages ago, it was you've got on one side you've got Hill Street Blues, and on the other side you've got the X-Files, and the difference between the two is Twin Peaks, primarily through the fact of them filming it to the same standard that a Hollywood movie was made. Instead of using this really crappy video footage, very episodic, very rote characters, very repetitive storylines, suddenly we had this very open-ended, flowing story. And with the X-Files, you got this incredibly high budget for a TV show, using film stock for a start, and lighting and cinematography that would grace any Hollywood movie. There's this like gap in the middle, which is Twin Peaks, which was really the start of what was called the golden age of television, with the likes of Sopranos and Breaking Bad and Game of Thrones, and all these shows really began with Twin Peaks. And the music, the soundtrack, the production values, the complexity of the narrative, the complexity of the characters, and what X-Files denoted as canon, which was American TV was often made so that you could replay episodes in any order, with the Hill Street Blues, sort of scenario where basically you can play them in any order because the episode is complete. But with, like, say, canon episodes of the X-Files, there's this ongoing story that continues through seasons. And with Twin Peaks, it was a TV series, but it was really a mini-series in that it had this Laura Palmer arriving dead in a plastic bag at the start in that unforgettable opening of what became a TV sensation at the time, and has still got probably the biggest cult following of any TV series outside of Star Trek or Doctor Who, and having this very long form story, and also the way that it was presented with this surreal, frightening, hilarious, demonic. It was really for me, it was the film that followed on from Blue Velvet and ignored the tropes of Wild at Heart. It changed television forever, and it ushered in the golden age of TV when people were brave enough to take those risks, which didn't happen immediately. There was certainly very, very high production value quality TV like the X-Files. I think even Northern Exposure to a degree. But it was really sort of towards the start of the 2000s that those things became what we know as The Wire and The Sopranos and everything else, having those incredibly good production values, but also incredibly strong, complicated writing, characters and scenarios and storylines that could the episode 1 to season 3, episode 5 might still have these threads of a story going through it. And I think it was all down to The incredible risk they took with making Twin Peaks, I still don't know how it got made. But it did, and it lasted for 2 seasons. And I would certainly give the season 1 a 10 out of 10 for quality, for memorable moments, for an astonishing cast of characters. There was so Machen Amick, Laura Finn Boyle, Sherilyn Fenn, Peggy Lipton. There was just so... Jack Nance from Eraserhead. He was the star of Eraserhead. Joan Chen, Ray Wise, and Carl McLachlan at its centre, creating this archetype of a Boy Scout, an FBI Boy Scout, who then showed to have these incredibly spiritual conversations about the crimes that he was dealing with, where he was sort of involved the supernatural to a degree. But it was also an extension of the utopian ideal of America, this small town, Twin Peaks, and the fact that there was this incredibly dark underbelly. It was also very, very ahead of the curve on domestic violence. You've got the domestic violence of Laura Palmer herself, what she suffered, but you've also got the Machen what's her name? Machen Amick. I said her name wrong earlier. Her character, and Leo, I think her boyfriend, was, the archetypal abusive home relationship where she tries to carry on as though everything is normal, and he's this controlling psychopath, very violent man. And I think it was ahead of the curve. And we even got David Duchovny as a trans character, which was very ahead of the curve. It was an amazing event, and obviously it would peter out. Everyone wanted to know who killed Laura Palmer, and Lynch kind of didn't want to reveal that, and he sort of backed away. He wrote it with Mark Frost, and I think Mark Frost wanted to reveal the killer of Laura Palmer, and David Lynch wanted it to be a much more open-ended story. It was a story about a homecoming queen washing up covered in plastic in a river, dead, suffering horrible abuse, and finding out in this very close-knit small town who was responsible, and sending in this Boy Scout, Carl McLachlan character, who gradually finds that virtually everyone has these terrible interior lives fraught with horrible abuse and nightmarish people in the background. And it really was a game-changing event, and I'm going to give the season 1 a 10 out of 10. Season 2, I'm only going to give a 6 out of 10. It went off the rails, but I'll say this, it's not so much that season 1 is perfect and season 2 isn't. I thought that up until the reveal of Laura Palmer's killer, which I was very surprised about when it happened, and I thought that was brilliant. I thought that the quality level, even though it dipped, was still really quite high. It's just after that reveal that they scrambled to make twice as many episodes of the first season to capitalise on the first season. And then they ended up drifting into the much lesser storylines, the James storylines, I think the fans of Twin Peaks would call it, where the people weren't as interesting. But what it did do was involve the whole supernatural, existential, universal themes of the Black Lodge and these places where evil or good lurks in the universe. And that would be very influential on a lot of the stuff that Lynch would do after. So even though he wasn't really as involved by that point, and those last episodes of James riding around on his motorcycle aren't that interesting, it's certainly, given what came, a very interesting collection of ideas that don't land as perfectly as season 1. And I think up until we found out who Laura was, I don't think that was it wasn't terrible. It just didn't have the intrigue. Every character landed in that first season. You wanted to know everything about the log lady. You wanted to know everything about the girls that worked in the diner and their interior lives and what was going on behind the scenes, and Laura Palmer's family. And when we got down to James on his motorcycle, no one really cared. But the music will never be forgotten, and there's probably 5 different albums created for music for Twin Peaks, which is incredible. So I'm going to play one more from that Lynch and Angelo Badalamenti composed score for that, which is Audrey's Dance, maybe my favourite of all of them. You're with Julian on the Brown Notes David Lynch special, trawling through every project in his career in the lens mainly of the fact that he had more involvement with the music involved in his projects than I can think of any director, from the relationship he had with Angelo Badalamenti and their co-composing credits and lyrics, and his relationships with other musical artists, all the way down to the individual tracks that were chosen. And that was from the iconic first Twin Peaks soundtrack album, and that was Audrey's Dance, which was the theme music for Sherilyn Fenn, a breakout star from that film, whose own trajectory in the Twin Peaks universe ended up being unbelievably nightmarish, actually nightmarishly, shudderingly terrible. And that was the second season was cancelled after about 30 episodes. I don't know what they were thinking. I think the first season had 8 episodes, and they didn't miss a beat. And then suddenly they just decided to just make it like it was Friends or something, or The Big Bang Theory, and just keep going. And eventually it was cancelled. But to a degree, David Lynch tried to wrest it back. And maybe his saving there was the movie Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, which was a huge disaster on release, and everyone hated it, and it dovetailed into the notion that Twin Peaks had collapsed in its second series. Now, though, it is a highly regarded film, a very much a cult film, and regarded as one of his finest, and it's got an awful lot of intrigue in there. It's the actress Cheryl Lee, who plays Laura Palmer, who at one point was probably the most famous girl in America, initially was cast in the first season of Twin Peaks because they had spent all of their budget on casting, and they only wanted her to be a dead girl, and not be a character. And they just employed a local girl who hadn't really ever acted. And then they actually had her in a couple of scenes where they were looking back on the life of Laura Palmer before the murder, and realised how much presence she had and how incredible she looked on screen. And she became this bigger and bigger. I mean, The Diary of Laura Palmer was a bestseller around the time of Twin Peaks, and she does get her day in the sun in Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, which leads up to the murder. And has a lot of the same people in it, including David Bowie with a terrible accent, which he hates, and Chris Isaac, and Harry Dean Stanton, Ray Wise, Carl McLaughlin, and so on. Moira Kelly stands in for Lara Flynn Boyle here. That was an interesting one as well, because Lara Flynn Boyle was in a relationship with Carl McLaughlin and apparently wasn't happy with the way that they wanted to go in Twin Peaks, which was him having a relationship with the much younger Sherilyn Fenn, who was a peer of the Lara Flynn Boyle character, and she was not happy with this, and Carl McLaughlin basically expressed that. And it does wonder, because she was probably arguably the best female character in Twin Peaks was Sherilyn Fenn's character, Audrey. A fascinating femme fatale, noir-esque character. She was amazing. And Fire Walk With Me was a more violent and abrasive world even than the darker side of Twin Peaks, but it is held up very, very well over the years. Its appreciation for it has only grown, and people often count it as one of Lynch's best. I'm going to give it an 8.5 out of 10. I don't know that it does all fit together brilliantly, but what works is incredible, and it also hasn't aged poorly. So from that excellent soundtrack to Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me, the motion picture version of Twin Peaks, which serves as a bridge between the original TV series and Twin Peaks: The Return many years later, this incredible track from the soundtrack called The Pink Room. It's from the Twin Peaks Fire Walk With Me soundtrack from Angelo Badalamenti, which saw a bit of a dip-off from Lynch as the success of Twin Peaks and the follow-up, the whole thing's kind of collapsed. And he didn't do a film again until 1997 and Lost Highway. And this is where I part ways with a lot of Lynch fans who claim it to be, one of his best works. I think here the pretension overwhelmed the substance quite to a degree. It had Bill Pullman and Patricia Arquette and Balthazar Getty, Robert Blake, and Gary Busey as well. And the Bill Pullman character fannying around in a hotel room, receiving a video, and almost like a very it's like Wild at Heart goes too far in one direction, and Lost Highway is almost like a film that goes too far in the opposite direction. I don't think it's got the substance to really add up to what it is. I feel like he was much, much better at doing this in other projects, particularly the one that will come up soon. With this unknowable, nightmarish vision of the universe, I don't know that there was that much substance in Lost Highway. There'll probably be fans of it, and I think a lot of that might go down to the stylization of the movie more than its content. I'd give it a 6.5 out of 10, and I would say that it is probably more punishing than rewarding in that sense, like Inland Empire will be probably. And I haven't seen every single Lynch project, so we're going to hit a couple that I haven't seen very shortly in the next film. One thing that was a roaring success of Lost Highway was not just the music by, I assume, Angelo Badalamenti. Yep, but it was the song choices on the soundtrack that actually went top 10 in America. The soundtrack, it was a top 10 selling soundtrack, which featured a lot of the post-grunge universe artists, including Trent Reznor and Nine Inch Nails. Let's hope you don't hit me with adverts for this one. The Perfect Drug from Nine Inch Nails. Nine Inch Nails would go on to work with Lynch again, particularly as a live band in the Roadhouse in the immortal episode 8 of Twin Peaks: The Return. But from The Lost Highway from 97, this is The Perfect Drug. That's Nine Inch Nails, The Perfect Drug, from the top 10 album from The Lost Highway. I don't think the film itself would have actually made much of a dent there. From that, he made the hilariously titled The Straight Story, one of two projects from David Lynch that I haven't actually seen, I feel ashamed of, starring Richard Farnsworth as an old man who travels across America trying to, in his lawnmower. Is it his lawnmower? When he hears his brother has had a stroke and he hasn't spoken to him for years, because his legs are too impaired for him to receive a driver's license, he hitches a trailer to his recently purchased 30-year-old John Deere tractor, which has a maximum speed of 5 miles an hour. A very metaphorical film, and delivered without irony or any sort of subterfuge, as a very straight film. I haven't seen it. It did open to very strong reviews. Like I said, I think the lead actor was the oldest male to be nominated for Best Actor Oscar at the time of the film's release. And Angelo Badalamenti was back on board for soundtrack work, so we're going to hear from that 99 film, A Straight Story, some music. Now is some of the soundtrack by long-term David Lynch collaborator Angelo Badalamenti for Straight Story, a film I haven't actually seen, but I'm walking through every David Lynch project since his death on the 15th of January, age 78, and his birthday yesterday, leaving a huge hole in cinema and an incredible legacy which will be picked over forever. And the fact that, as I said at the start, he's never directed a blockbuster or massively commercially successful film, but he's as famous as Steven Spielberg. So he must have been doing something right. And one of several projects to get top marks on this review of his career is Mullholland Drive in 2001. I'm going to put links to the original reviews of Twin Peaks: The Return and Mullholland Drive, both of which I gave 10 out of 10 to, a while ago. I don't know how many years ago I reviewed Mullholland Drive, starring in a star-making role Naomi Watts and Laura Haring, and controversial at the time for its open-ended meaning. I found it to be a very actually understandable movie if I've got my interpretation of what happened, and one of the saddest movies ever. The BBC had a poll a few years back with the top 100 directors in the world or something like that, and rating all of the films released this century, and Mullholland Drive was ranked the number one best film of the 21st century. Ironically, In the Mood for Love was number 2, which is probably the only film I can think of that's even sadder. Mullholland Drive is an incredible film, and Naomi Watts could have easily got an Oscar for her performance. And for me, the film is basically Naomi Watts envisaging herself as who she wanted to be when she came into Hollywood. The lighting of her is glowing. She's so beautiful. Everyone loves her. And towards the end of the movie, this murder mystery where she's in love with the Laura Haring character, and they have this incredibly, Laura Haring's an amnesiac and connected with this murder mystery, and Naomi Watts is playing the sleuth and so on. There's this astonishing moment towards the last third where the singer, have I got the right singer? I can't remember her name. Rebecca Del Rio comes on stage and performs the song Crying. And for me, that's a pivotal moment in the film. It's one of the best uses of a singer on stage in any film. And he did that very, very well. Already spoken about the Roadhouse in the Twin Peaks universe being used for music often. Even Julie Cruz back to the start of the series, and then 9 Inch Nails towards the third season, many years later. And also the Dean Stockwell character singing Candy Coloured Clown called the Sandman. He uses singers on stage to convey stuff so well. And for me, it's the best use of a singer on stage in any film. Halfway through, the singer actually collapses on stage, and you're watching the two lead actresses who are in love at that point, watching with tears streaming down their faces performance. And for me, my interpretation is when she collapses on stage and the music carries on, her voice carries on singing, I get the impression that the other female character is appalled by this, that the truth isn't real. But the Naomi Watts character seems to still be invested because she wants to believe in the perfect universe. And you can almost feel this fissure open up between them. And when they leave that auditorium, Naomi Watts, it's almost like that somebody has lifted up the blinds, like they do in the film Insomnia, and that let the light in. And suddenly the real world comes in, and it's a horrible one. And the whole universe that Naomi Watts has been living in, this dream fabricated universe, falls away to this incredibly bitter and broken and abused one, where her life's been terrible and it's not been anything like this starlet coming to Hollywood. She's been chewed up and spat out, leading to the murder that kicked the whole film off. It's a masterpiece on every level, stylistically beautiful. The two lead actresses are just phenomenal. And it's just an incredible film, an unforgettable film. And many would call it the pinnacle of David Lynch's career. And I'm going to give it a straight 10 out of 10, like I think I did 10 years or more ago. And this is Rebecca Del Rio. We won't get to see her, unfortunately, collapsing. So if you could just imagine her just collapsing around halfway through. Again, Roy Orbison. Yeah, it's certainly a very powerful scene. Interpret it how you want, that's how I interpret it. And I certainly think the fissure in their relationship and the crack of reality coming back to the story and leaving behind this sort of day-glow, fluffy world that Naomi Watts has invented is heartbreaking. And it's definitely that scene that does it. That was Rebecca Del Rio and Llorando, or Crying, which is a theme going back to Blue Velvet and the use of another Roy Orbison track. After that, another thing I hadn't seen, which is Inland Empire from 2006, which gets middling reviews compared to his greatest work. Again, starring Laura Dern, also Justin Theroux, who was in the previous film. Harry Dean Stanton and Jeremy Irons show up. A very punishing film from what I've heard. 3 hours of the darkest, and almost like he ran with Mullholland Drive. Mullholland Drive was very much a film about Hollywood, and this seems to be similarly about that world, but from a much more abstract and difficult and dark perspective. I can't tell you much about it because I still haven't seen it, but I can play you one of the songs from the soundtrack featuring vocals from David Lynch, who recorded 3 albums, and I mentioned that he's so intertwined with the music fabric of his project. So this is Ghost of Love. Featuring the man himself, this has been a tribute to David Lynch, who passed away 6 days ago now, leaving an impossible void in cinema and TV history. And that was his song Ghost of Love, used in the Inland Empire soundtrack, his final film, but certainly not his final project. I can't believe how well I've timed this to a degree, considering it's 2 hours of unplanned radio. The final project that David Lynch would make was happily a defining one, and happily something that reframed people's opinions, I think, on a lot of previous work as well, particularly the Twin Peaks universe. And that was Twin Peaks Season 3. I've always called it Twin Peaks The Return. It's also called Twin Peaks A Limited Event Series. And just as the original 8 episodes of Twin Peaks redefined television from both a thematic and a technical level, ushering in the golden age of television with regards to its production values and so on, and also the complexity of its narratives and characters, and the use of surreal and sometimes, supernatural elements, and the darkness that he reared up with in Blue Velvet. The 18 hours of Twin Peaks The Return was a water cooler moment again. If you were a fan of Twin Peaks The Return, there's been nothing remotely close to the water cooler element of that show. I think water cooler elements, the idea of people talking about the previous episode around the water cooler in an office, almost originated with that first season of Twin Peaks. And we live in an era where a 10-hour-long TV show is released in one go on Netflix, so that you can watch the whole thing in one weekend. Crucially, with the 18 hours of Twin Peaks 3, each one was released a week apart, and I was part of that online discussion, which was incredible. And they needed each episode to have existed for a week, and for everyone to have poured through each aspect of it in insane detail that I've never seen before. It was unbelievably unwavering in its commitment to its source, and being no reward at all for having watched Twin Peaks, yet you having to have watched all of Twin Peaks to have any idea what was going on at all. It was the most uncompromising TV series of its stature ever to have been made. I'll put on the Mullholland Drive and Twin Peaks The Return reviews, but I gave it a 10 out of 10, which makes 4 projects: the Blue Velvet, Twin Peaks 1, Mullholland Drive, and Twin Peaks 3 that I've given 10 out of 10 to on this show in celebration of David Lynch. It was, again, a unique paradigm, but this time it wasn't just a unique paradigm in TV. I actually rated it my number 1 best film of 2017. I wasn't the only person to include it in their Films of the Year list. For me, it was a new paradigm in what TV could be and in what film could be. And I go in at length on the review about why I class it as a film. There's lots of tropes that are repeating in TV series. And Twin Peaks The Return would often build up these environments and characters over a few episodes and leave them completely behind like a film does, and move into new areas. It was also wild. Episode 8 from Twin Peaks 3 remains an unrepeatable TV event. 40 minutes nearly of abstract art house cinema on a virtually mainstream TV show with virtually no dialogue, and with the notion of the evil that killed Laura Palmer arriving from across the universe when the first atomic bomb exploded. And I think the way they treated the atomic bomb in that sequence, that epic sequence, was a big influence on Christopher Nolan and Oppenheimer, and particularly the scene where Oppenheimer gives a talk to a rapturous audience in a theatre and has these nightmarish visions and scratchy noises and all chaos going on. I think was definitely influenced by that episode. So I will put the links to the full reviews of those, but Twin Peaks: The Return was, again, just pushing the envelope as to what a film could be and what TV could be in a manner that no one has achieved anywhere near, and a fitting final project to the legend David Lynch. And from that, one of 3 soundtrack albums that came out connected with that project. This is a fitting end. I opened with the Angelo Badalamenti, David Lynch composition for Twin Peaks, but the famous worldwide version of that called Falling, featured Julie Cruz on vocals. And Julie Cruz actually came and played on stage in the Roadhouse in Twin Peaks: The Return, not many years before her own death, I think in 2022. So this is Angelo Badalamenti, David Lynch, and Julie Cruz, and The World Spins, which did, I think, appear on her Into the Night album decades before. Adios to you and to David.